and the Seed Science Department. So some of the students in that course are here tonight, and we're really pleased to have students from other courses coming. We have two outstanding speakers, but before that, and they're going to be introduced by former Governor Vilsack, who we are lucky enough to have participating in our course, and this is the third time he's been here for the students in the course. He is a distinguished fellow in the Big Mac program, and it is in that role that he's been able to participate in our course. So I'll hand it over to Governor Vilsack, and he can introduce this evening's speakers.
Thank you, Annette. This is a treat for me tonight. First of all, a word to the folks who were in Annette's class. It's my understanding you're filling out your evaluations tonight, and the two of us really need your help. So cut us a break, would you, in the evaluations. Secondly, we certainly appreciate all of those who came here tonight, especially those who seek extra credit. That was a great idea, that give you all extra credit to be here. This is a real treat for me to introduce two very good friends of mine. Gary Hirshberg is from New Hampshire and is the CEO of Stonyfield Farms. It is a company that is in the organic yogurt business. He is a man who started this company virtually from scratch. Went through some very difficult times as an entrepreneur, believed strongly and passionately in his dream, continued to work hard, and has grown a very, very successful company that is not only employing people and making money, but has really embraced climate change and the environment, and has developed a sustainable development program, which he'll talk about tonight, that indicates and shows that you can in fact make money by being sustainable and by being environmentally friendly and sensitive to climate change issues. And he has written a book on the way, and you saw it displayed. And I would encourage all of you to consider purchasing that book, because if you want to be involved in the future in business in this country, this is the cutting edge. This is the way to make it in the 21st century. The second person I want to introduce, and I'll introduce them both, and then they can take it from here, is another good friend, Walter Robb. Walter's from the other coast, the West Coast. He is currently the president and COO of Whole Foods, which is a grocery store chain that focuses on natural and organic foods in 38 states and 3 countries. He too started his professional and business career as an entrepreneur, borrowing money from his father-in-law to start his grocery store business, and he has helped Whole Foods grow into an extraordinarily successful and one of the most successful companies in the United States, part of the Fortune 425. So it's a very large corporation. But one of the things that's interesting about Walter and his company is it is not just simply about shareholder profits, which is what drives many companies today. It is about the responsibility not just to the shareholders, but also the team members and the employees, the responsibility to the community, the responsibility to the vendors and suppliers and customers, and the responsibility to the world. And as is the case with Gary, his company is committed to sustainability and to encouraging support for the environment. And they put essentially their money where their mouth is, establishing foundations to provide new opportunities in this area, and also operating their company in a very environmentally friendly way. These two gentlemen bring something today that I think is important for students to see, and that is passion and compassion in the business world. They also will challenge you and should challenge your traditional thinking about agriculture. Since they are so heavily committed to organic, they want to raise some questions. They want to stimulate debate and conversation tonight with their various presentations, and they want to show you perhaps a different way of thinking about things, hopefully that you've not maybe thought as much about, or maybe not have been exposed to as much as you will tonight. So I think it's a real opportunity, a real learning experience opportunity, and I'm thrilled to have them here. If they weren't here, I'd have to teach the class, and trust me, it would be far less interesting to all of you. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. Which of you two? We're going to start with Walter Robb. Walter, Iowa State students.
Better? Can you hear now? Is that better? Can you hear? Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction, Governor Vilsack. And I think I speak for Gary and myself in saying that over the last couple of years, as we've gotten to know your former governor, he may be from Iowa, but he's also a citizen of the world. And it's been one of the great experiences of my life, and I think Gary's life, too, to have a chance to meet him and Christy. I think you were very fortunate to have him as part of this class and also in your state. We came back for the caucuses this year, first time I ever had a chance to come back to Iowa, Precinct 72. And I also came one time in the summer to watch the campaign trail. And I left there with a tremendous appreciation for Iowa and how seriously all of you take your responsibility to democracy. I went back saying, you know, if any of that was happening in the rest of the country, we'd all be better off. So very soft spot in my heart for Iowa as a result of knowing you and Christy. So. You know, Iowa State, I also want to introduce a friend of mine and one of our suppliers who's from Iowa, Tim Beeler. Could you stand up, Tim? You may have heard of Beeler Pork. And he is an Iowa State graduate. And just a little bit further down, I'm going to ask him to come up for a few minutes to share a little bit of his story with you, if you don't mind, Tim, in the journey that he's been in with his company, raising hogs up by Sioux City. So, Iowa State, you have a long history, 150 years, right? You started out as a model farm, and you're a land-grant college, which is pretty cool. Lincoln set up the land-grant colleges, the public taxpayer dollars to support public education. If you look at that land-grant act, it's pretty phenomenal, the foresight that Lincoln had to set up these land-grant colleges. In 1959, looking at your history, you became the Iowa State University of Science and Technology, and that's part of your history too, and you were the first patent on blue cheese. We thank you for that. We sell a lot of blue cheese, as well as, I guess, the rotary, I learned today, a rotary hay baler and some other things. So you've definitely got science and technology in your background. But your most interesting graduate, the first African-American to go to Iowa State, was George Washington Carver, right? You all know that? And it turns out he was the masseuse and the trainer on the football team between 1933 and 1935. Based on your season last year, you might want to bring him back. I don't know. But you know, he invented, he was an entrepreneur for sure, 300 uses for peanuts. One of the things I thought that was really cool he did is he put technology on the road. He came up with this small mobile school for farmers that he took in through the south part of the United States. And that's a sort of technology in action, science in action, that I think is the type of thinking that this university is capable of, and I hope all of you will bring those sorts of ideas forward as you get out of school. Put this stuff into action and make changes in the world. So the quote, I pulled a couple quotes from George Washington Carver. His first one was, and I'm sorry I don't have this on the slides, I'd understood we were going to be in a smaller room. So young people, I want to beg of you, always keep your eyes open to what Mother Nature has to teach you. By doing so, you will learn many valuable things every day of your life. And the other one that really struck me was this. He says, anything will give up its secrets if you love it enough. Not only have I found that when I talk to the little flower, to the little peanut, they will give up their secrets, but I have found that when you silently commune with people, they give up their secrets also if you love them enough. So here's a scientist talking about love and communion with plants, talking about love and communion in science. I think this is a theme we'll come back to kind of at the end when I wrap up. I'm going to try to keep it short, let Gary talk a little bit, and I think it'd be interesting for us to do kind of a discussion, and so hopefully we can just stir it up a little bit, and then we can go from there. Let me start with some of my own background. At 21 years old, I borrowed $10,000 from my stepfather to start a small natural food store. Shoestring operation for many years, lost money for many years, and ran it for 10 years, and sold it, and ran another company for a few years, and then I put a store together, which I sold to Whole Foods Market, which was store number 11 for the company. back in 1991. So been doing this about 32 years in the retail. Whole Foods Market now is 277 stores plus or minus, 53,000 employees, and about just under $9 billion in sales run rate this year. So it's been an incredible journey, and we've made it up every step of the way. Made it up. Have no idea what we're doing. We're just figuring it out as we go. And that is what entrepreneurs do. In any case, Whole Foods Market started officially in 1980 in Austin, Texas, with a single store of about 10,000 square feet. That was the first largest supermarket in America for natural and organic foods. And our flagship store in Austin now, 25 years later, is 80,000 square feet, or 8-time acceleration in just a period of about 25 years. That is somehow parallels, I think, the growth in consumer interest in natural and organic products in this country. So we have common ground here, you and I, Gary and yourselves, in that we're research entrepreneurs too. And I really mean that seriously. We really don't have any idea where we're going next. We are literally making it up. And yes, we look like we're a big company now, but all along the way we've had to do the research because we are the largest natural and organic food retailer. And the organic industry, which is about $18 billion industry at this point, 3.5% of the market, has no real infrastructure. It has no research, it has no scientists, has no soil, has no land-grant colleges doing all the work to help it figure it out, and the same with organic business. We're kind of making it up. So that being said, listen, Whole Foods is not Holy Foods. We're not better than anyone else. We definitely have a point of view that sustainability is the future, and we are trying our best to express that through business. We're not perfect. We have our own challenges in our industry, and that is to say this question of, we're doing a lot of our own soul searching around the scale in agriculture and how to stay true to our principles. That sort of discussion. But we definitely think there's some learnings there that might be of interest to you today. So I want to begin with just a couple of thoughts before I actually talk through some examples in the marketplace today, which I'm sure you're all familiar. First of all, science and policy. This is a class on science and policy, right? Science, policy, and food. So it seems to me that land-grant colleges were all about experiments, scientists, science for all the people. Public taxpayer dollars, public research, public benefit. And it seems to me somewhere along the way, perhaps it was in 1985 with the Bayh-Dole Act, which allowed universities to privatize research and so forth. And I'm not saying this is a good thing or a bad thing, as I don't know enough about it. I'm a retailer, not a scientist. But it seemed like somewhere science was driving policy. It seemed that somewhere along the policy started to drive science. And money started to drive science. And say the science will do what the money wants it to do, as opposed to the science saying, here's what it is, and what policy does that suggest? Right? And so in 1985, we had Earl Butz saying, as the Secretary of Agriculture, get big or get out. That's what you need to do in agriculture. And you had a lot of public institutions receiving lots of money, private money, to do lots of private research, which was patented and was not necessarily for the public benefit. You could argue that a couple of different ways, I guess. You also had, in 1985, you had Senator McGovern from North Dakota holding hearings on the American health situation, the American diet, and his conclusion, the conclusion of his committee, which was the Senate Select Committee on Nutrition, was at the end of that was there was a concern about meat, eating too much meat. But when they published that finding, there was such a firestorm from the community about, particularly the producer community about that they had to change their finding to eat less meat that reduces your saturated fat content. And in 1985, what happened was, instead of taking the focus off food as a whole, the focus went to nutrients and nutrition. And it suddenly became okay to talk about that and not talk about food anymore. Somewhere along the way there, we lost our way talking about the whole food and started talking about saturated fat and fiber and these things. And somehow was able to construct a food that wasn't actually very good for you, didn't even taste very good, but it had all the proper nutrients, right? And so you have that going on. You have this intersection between science and policy, and you have a time during the most recent administration where 1,000 scientists are saying, we're not being listened to. Our science is being pushed under the rug. So this dance, this balance between science and policy in the food marketplace is one I think that's a delicate one. It's probably akin to making sausage. There's a constant mixing that needs to go on. And I'm going to suggest to you that I think that the balance needs to be relooked at between science and policy. Policymakers need good science. Farmers need good science and research. But I think we've got to look at the balance of those two as it's unfolding. You have a good example right now of this thing starting to change in Kansas, where you have the head environmental administrator for the state saying, I'm not going to approve the 2 coal plants based on the science of global warming. And the governor, Sebelius, saying, I agree. So science is, in that particular case, is kind of reemerging, saying that science around global warming is somewhat troubling. So that's the first point, the dance between science, policy, and food. The second is, we live in an extraordinary time. We've got $100 barrel oil, and Gary's going to talk some more about this. We've got food prices inflating at 5 to 6% a year. I have to build into our budget for our company a food inflation of 5 to 6% a year. And I know that's true for many of the other larger companies. I talked to Costco, I talked to Cisco. They're all building their budgets that way. That means if you're growing less than 5%, in real terms, you're not actually growing your company. That is a serious thing. It's going to show up in food prices. It's got to be a concern for any retailer. You take some of the cereal manufacturers now that have been making their cereal with corn they've hedged, like the Southwest hedges oil at 60%. When those prices of food fully lands, there's a concern about what's going to happen to the price of food. We live in a time of healthcare. We have healthcare now at a $2 trillion a year business economy, so to speak. It's 20% of the GDP in this country, and 95% of that expenditure is not preventative in nature. And we have a very unhealthy country. We have many people obese. We have lots of juvenile diabetes. We have cancers of every type running wild, and we have basically a cost which is running out of control in our business alone. Healthcare, and even though we put together a fairly progressive plan, is escalating at 7% a year. And Howard Schultz from Starbucks told me in the last couple months that healthcare is a bigger cost for him at Starbucks than coffee beans. This is affecting all of us. We live in a time where the energy, the petroleum reserves, you could argue peak oil, you could say maybe there's more, but all these things there are contributing to also the climate change, where you have a international panel of respected scientists saying it's unequivocal that global warming is happening, unequivocal, and laying out the scenarios for reducing it. Perhaps some of you went to Dennis Avery this afternoon and you maybe heard a different point of view on this, and that's fine. That's what education's all about, is the sausage making of hearing those points of views. But I mean, this is a document that you should definitely read if you have not read that. It's up on the web, IPCC. So we live in this time, and then so a third thing I want to talk about is agriculture, the sort of basis of production and research around agriculture, right? Well, for many years, it seems like since World War II, the agriculture industry was able to take the nitrogen gas from the bombs in World War II and convert that into fertilizers. And since that time, the pursuit in agriculture of yield above all else, the need to produce more and more, and the need to produce more and more to save the world, to feed the world. This was the argument that's advanced in order to basically say this is what agriculture needs to do. And there's certainly some good in that. I'm not saying this is an either-or situation, but the science, and I have prepared a PDF for your class. It's got all the science that I'm going to refer to here for you so you can look at it. It's all in there. The fact is the USDA's own data suggests that over the last 30 years, the major nutrients in 43 garden crops has declined between 13 and 30%. So in fact, Americans are eating more and getting less. That's also true for corn and soybeans. The protein content of corn and soybeans has declined in the high-yield varieties up to 20%. And it turns out the hunger problem is still here. We have 900 million hungry people that basically defined by the UN as people that don't have enough to eat every day. And we still have 6.5 billion people on the planet. We have 1 billion that are living on less than $1 a day. So and with the projections for climate change, it's pretty clear that we're going to have more of agricultural land underwater, depending on which scenario you look at, which is going to put more people at risk for hunger and famine. So on the other hand, the myth about organic, that it cannot feed the world, organically grown food cannot feed the world, has been put to rest with studies by University of Michigan and other places that have demonstrated, studying parallel systems, in some cases 290 separate studies, that in fact is just not true. And in fact, actually in drought conditions, organic systems produce more yield than conventional systems. And in fact, when you compare organic crops next to conventional crops side by side, peer-reviewed science, the organic crops have higher antioxidants, higher nutrient quality, and less pesticide residues, et cetera. You would expect that. So again, this is all in your packet. This was a study that we, in the Organic Center, which is a nonprofit board I sit on, funded at Washington State. And for the last 3 years, we've been growing the crops side by side to like conditions, et cetera, peer-reviewed science quality to demonstrate this point. So some of these myths out there that about organic agriculture are simply not true. And the science is now, and I hope many of you will then jump into this because we really need the science, will help us to show the real importance of sustainable ag systems. So, okay, in any case, with that sort of background, let's just look at a couple of the some of the issues that are out there in the marketplace now. Farm Bill, I think Gary's going to talk about this a little bit, but the Farm Bill is that bill which you have one of the great agricultural people in this country, in Senator Harkin from Iowa, and he has been the champion, the consistent champion for the sustainable ag industry up on Capitol Hill, in addition to his other responsibilities. This Farm Bill is the one that funds, it's a 5-year bill that funds all the agriculture activities, but 85% of the dollars goes to 5 crops. There's no funding for fruit and vegetables in there, which you think would have something to do with our health situation. And essentially, it's more of a subsidy bill. $5 billion, this is Senator Harkin's numbers to me, $5 billion out of the $14 billion annually here goes to subsidize farmland that was in the pre-1980 production levels. So the suggestion here in the Farm Bill is we need more research to support. Organic is 3.5% of the market economy. We need 3.5% of the research dollars. The organic standards, are you going to talk about that, Gary, the organic standards bill a little bit? 10 years in the making. It was passed in 1990, fully realized in 2000. And essentially there, it's a work in progress. When that bill was put together, it was funded, but the research title was taken out at the last minute. So sort of like, here's the ability to do it, but there's no dollars to support that. Now, if organic has any, it's already 3.5% of the economy. If it has any hope of progressing to anything more than a rounding error, it's going to need the research and the support from places like Iowa State and places that have the knowledge about farms. Cloning is another area that you saw in the paper in the Des Moines Register this last week about the confusion around the natural label. This is, it seems like every day you pick up the paper, there is some sort of story about a food safety or cloning or natural meat or natural labels. And so cloning is another example where, Whole Foods' position on cloning is we're not going to sell cloned, meat and dairy from cloned animals. This is a question around science where all the FDA has to actually prove is that the cloned animal produces substantial equivalent proteins as the non-cloned animal. That's a pretty low barrier for entry to say that's a safe product for the public, and somewhere along in there is the right for the consumer to know and make that choice as to what type of food they want. Food safety, we had the spinach recall in September of 2006, I think, and in the end, the science that it was originally attributed to the organic folks, which really was not true. In the end, what was proven was that there was a fairly heavy animal operation 100 yards from the corner of the spinach field, and the dust was the vector that carried the E. coli from the concentrated animals across there to the spinach. And the spinach package that actually got people sick were the ones who were at the end of their code date, 16, 17 days out. And that's what actually caused the sickness. And so there's some real concerns about E. coli in terms of the byproducts from ethanol plants. Real concerns about the E. coli virus itself is mutating. So there's lots going on with food safety, E. coli, spinach, the tainted beef. We had a recall of 1 million pounds of ground beef in the last 3 months from the Cargill plant. That is a huge amount of ground beef being servicing into the school system. And GMOs is a whole other topic, and I think I'll wait on that one to maybe for the discussion. But let me just say that I'm not as Gary said, I'm not a Luddite. I'm not against progress. I have 2 boys that have a genetic condition that only can be helped by research. So I'm not sitting here saying, let's not go forward. But in agriculture, I say I don't think we need to go as quickly and put it into the marketplace until we've done more work to really test this and make sure it's safe. Because right now the evidence is there's drift of GM crops into non-GM crops, depriving consumers of the choice, but also creating liability problems for some of the farmers, to where in the California legislature this last year, they actually put a bill together to protect farmers that are the non-GMO farmers from the unintentional drift. You have superweeds. You just had the first reported superweed, the second generation Johnson grass here in Iowa, according to the scientists that I talked to, that is immune to the GMO. In other words, it's evolved. The weed is evolved. The argument for GMO seeds is less pesticides. Well, in fact, what's happening in many cases is more pesticides. And those pesticides are the ones that really have a link to many serious conditions. Human conditions have an effect. The pesticides have an effect on particularly young people and babies. So there's concerns there. There's concerns about allergens that are being produced, novel allergens that are affecting various people. There's a number of things around the concentration of the seed supply that are also concerns. So there are things to talk about with the GMO foods. The organic standard says no GMOs in the organic standard. So there is an opportunity there for people to have a choice. The government hadn't been willing to separate and label that so that consumers can have the choice. We're right in the middle of that discussion right now. And finally, animal welfare. If I had to share with you one thing that I think is on consumers' minds, it's about general consumers' minds, maybe not Iowa consumers' minds, but who are not growing up on a farm or around farms, is how are the animals being treated? This is huge. And I made the point earlier that we're living in a fishbowl now, and you can expect anything that you're doing is going to be up on YouTube or the internet before too long. And what you may think is an appropriate practice is going to be scrutinized by hundreds of millions of thousands of viewers who are going to make up their own mind about that. And in any case, I want to say something about what Whole Foods has done about it, and then I'd like to have Tim say just a few minutes about what's happened at Beeler Pork. And again, I recognize, how many of you have actually been to a Whole Foods? Anybody been to Whole Foods? Wow. Okay. Some of you don't even know who I am or what I'm talking about up here, but we have large, we've got these large supermarkets. They're average about 50,000 square feet, so similar to a Hy-Vee, in all the fresh departments around the store, and butcher shop, fish shop, produce, and all that sort of thing. And in any case, we started 4 years ago using the stakeholder model, and we brought together the activists, animal producers, scientists, and the Whole Foods, and we sat in a room, and we went species by species for 4 years, every single species, to kind of work through what are the standards to raise these animals, try to understand the production cycle for every single species. And out of that, we came up with a new set of standards, of 5-step standards to kind of help animals, to kind of make a clearer standard for how to raise animals. And I think that this issue of animal welfare is going to continue to get political dialogue. It's going to continue to affect the marketplace, and it's going to continue to emerge as an issue. In California, again, this may be the left coast, but there's a ballot initiative that just qualified for this fall that had by over 1 million signatures around the protection of, it's called the California Farm Animal Act, and you can check it out on the web if you want to, what's going on there. So let me bring up Tim now, because Tim is an Iowan, graduated from Iowa State. His company is Beeler Pork, and he's one of our fine suppliers. And I'll have him share a little bit about his journey with you as a producer in this area. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Is that working?
Maybe I don't need it. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. Is it on now? Okay, we're going to do a little exercise first. Pull out a piece of paper. Everybody's got a pencil. And draw a picture of a stick person. Now, I've only got a few seconds to talk, so you got to do this fast.
Oh, just want to hit that, punch it up. No, when I finish.
All right, y'all done? Hand it to your neighbor. So there's no cheating. All right. Let your neighbor take a look at it. Now I want to see a show of hands of the stick person that has a set of ears. 1. You are going to be a marketing genius. Okay? To drive the point home, we would all rather talk than listen, wouldn't we? And I'm no exception. I'm a redneck pig farmer from Iowa. I went to Iowa State, attended this university for 5 years, finally got my 4.8 GPA per year for 5 years, adds up to 4. Somehow, I got invited to Whole Foods Animal Compassion Standards meetings in Austin, Texas 4 years ago. And believe me, I was a conventional pig farmer. Total confinement, gestation crates, farrowing crates, confinement operation, the whole 9 yards. Why they invited me, I have no idea. But they gave us fair warning. They told us all the animal activists were going to be there. And I went into that meeting and I thought, boy, am I going to change their mind. I'm going to let them have it. I'm going to tell them how to raise pigs. Well, I walked into the meeting that day, and the first fellow I met was Steve Gross from PETA. And I'm thinking, oh, boy, here we go. We shook hands, and he said, yeah, I know you. I've Googled you. I had the fortune and the opportunity, and I can say that sincerely now, to sit right next to him for 2 days on this side and right next to this fella on the other side. And for the first half day, every point that came up, these animal activists were telling us how to raise pigs, and I tried to combat them. I tried to argue. I tried to tell them they were all wet, that we know how to raise pigs, and you're not going to tell us how to farm, and on and on and on. And I was just getting my head handed back to me on a silver platter time after time after time. So finally I decided, you know what? Just shut up. Just shut up. Maybe you made a mistake coming here, but you know what? Maybe you ought to listen to these people. Because after you get through the basic philosophical differences, they're people just like us, and they have concerns about their families just like us, and they have concerns about what they eat, and they have concerns about the way the animals are being raised. So, the second half of the day, I just sat and listened. And about 2:30 in the afternoon, I get a nudge from Walter over here saying, how come you're not talking? I said, I wasn't accomplishing anything. So, that meeting lasted 2 days, and then I think we went home. About 6 months later, we came back, went through another 2 days. But as a result of it, sitting there listening to these people, I'm thinking, you know, they're not really asking us to do that much different. Gosh, we used to raise pigs that way. When I was 7 and 8 and 9 years old, I grew up with a pitchfork in my hand. Our pigs were outside. Everything they're wanting us to do, I've done. So can we do it again? I think so. So upon the conclusion of those meetings, we took a trip to Europe and wanted to look at all these animal compassion farms we'd heard about. Went over there and saw that they weren't really doing anything that unusual, and it's something that we thought we could do. So we came home and we built what I would consider to be the first animal compassion pig farm from start to finish in the entire United States. Now, there's other people out there that have bits and pieces of it, but I think we were the first ones to put the whole thing together. And on our farm, we have no gestation crates, probably, and that, you know, how many of you have raised pigs? No gestation crates, that's no big deal, is it? We used to do it all the time. Kept sows in pens. Then in came the gestation crate. Well, you know what? That was easy to get rid of. They're gone. We don't have them. We have large nests, deep-bedded nests for the sows to go in, and every one of our gestating sows can go outside whenever she wants to, 24/7. There's no doors on that barn. She can go outside. After she gets moved from gestation into farrowing, or the maternity stables as we call them, each sow has her own individual maternity room. There are no farrowing crates. It's a 6-by-8 square foot box or maternity ward. She's free to get up, turn around, walk around, do whatever she does. We upped our weaning age to 28 days, which is better for the sow anyway, better productivity. You'll find that you'll get better results. And then once after they're weaned, we built animal compassion finishing barns. And boy, did people really think we were crazy with this one. Because all of our finishing pigs can go outside 24/7. They're, again, deep-bedded nest. There's about 100 pigs to a pen, and they have a minimum of 8 square feet rather than the typical 6 3/4 or 7. And so again, all deep-bedded, outdoors, sunshine, the whole thing. And I'm not going to say it's been easy, because it hasn't. And we've had to re-educate ourselves on how to raise pigs, believe it or not. But we have accomplished it. And the nice thing about it is because we did it, we have a tremendous customer to sell this product to. Right today, Whole Foods is buying every single pig we can raise. So, thank you.
That's great, man. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Listen, in the interest of time, I got a couple more things I want to say, but why don't you come up and I'll kind of come in on the backside. Does that sound right? Yeah. Please welcome Gary Hirshberg.
Okay, thanks.
You want this?
So I'm gonna be also to the point here, so we can ideally have some question and answer. Let me just tell you a quick little bit about me and how I got into this whole thing. Stonyfield, as Tom mentioned, is now a 25-year-old company. We'll do about $325 million in sales this year. But we started, like everyone starts, we started with 7 cows in 1983, and without any idea of what we were doing. But what I had studied in the decade before that, when I was, in many cases, your ages, and in subsequent, after college, going off to do research, is what I had learned is that our current ag system is actually broken. And it's only worse so now. What have we got to show for it? We have depleted soils. We've lost half of the topsoils that were here in this country when Lewis and Clark made their way across. We have depleted water tables. Right now in the Texas Panhandle, you can measure now the drop in fossil waters. This is waters that don't get replenished by rain. These waters have been there for thousands and thousands of years. And, in our current agriculture, where we're shipping water across the country in the form of lettuce, we're depleting water tables all over the place. What have we got in the Gulf of Mexico? We have something called a hypoxia. Maybe you've read about it. A giant area about the size of Rhode Island. You can say, Rhode Island, that's a tiny little state. It's growing 20% annually. This area is about 60 miles by 100 miles. And what it is an area where there is no oxygen. Therefore, there is no plankton, there is no algae, there are no fish, there are no crustaceans, there are no birds, there's no mammals, there's nothing. It's a giant body of sterile water. And there's 146 of these around the world. And why are they there? Because the excess amount of nitrogen that we're applying to our agriculture that is running in runoff into tributaries that ultimately makes its way to the Mississippi River, because again, we're not investing in holding our soils. We've been dependent on the ability to put annual doses of synthesized fertility into the land instead of putting carbon and nitrogen back in the land on a permanent basis. What we've been doing is we've been applying annual doses of fertility, and the net result of that, in combination with our failure to recognize the importance of preserving our topsoil, which is our equity, our nation's equity, and there's no better topsoil in this nation than that's within 50 miles of where we're standing right now. But our failure to protect it is, in fact, spelling demise. But in this particular case, by not restricting erosion, we're exporting our nutrients off, which is fine, except for the fact that it's going into the seas and killing the seas. And if we think climate change is a problem, and it is, and that's my background, by the way, then imagine the problem of killing off our estuaries around the world, because that's where life starts. That's where everything begins, the whole food chain. Now this is, I'm sure you're thrilled, you invited this really depressing guy to come talk to you later this afternoon. You're thinking, how the heck do I get out of here, and when does my extra credit kick in? But let me just take you a tad further. So I studied this stuff and was basically depressed. I thought, gosh, this isn't so good. I thought business was the source of all things bad. I decided that I was going to get the heck away from business. So I went to work at an ecological research center on Cape Cod. And there, in a building that was the size of about probably a fifth of this auditorium, we discovered that year-round we could feed 10 families 3 meals a day, 365 days a year, using no fossil fuels, no chemical fertilizers, no pesticides, no herbicides. 100% solar and wind powered. You could come into this building in the middle of winter with 4 feet of snow outside, and there would be bananas growing, and figs, and papayas. And what we were doing in this building was we were mimicking nature's complexity. we were using big tanks of water to store the sun's rays that would strike during the day through the south side glazing. And at night, those tanks of water would re-radiate and keep the building temperate for the plants. And then since we had water, we grew fish, and we could produce 100 pounds of organic, delicious fish in these 5-foot tall by 5-foot diameter tanks. And since we had fish, and the fish waste would trickle to the bottom, much like the way that we treat our waste treatment, we had to pump it out. So we had a nutrient-rich, nitrogen-rich, warm irrigant that we would use to fertilize the gardens that were all around these tanks. And since we had gardens and we had fish, we took the weeds from the gardens, we took the excess leafy matter, and pulled that and put it back into the tanks that fed the fish, these herbivorous fish. We grew tilapia, which are now a farm-raised fish. Tilapia have been known to leap up on the banks of the Amazon, chew on grasses, and roll back in the water. So they're perfect for aquaculture because they can stand it when us humans screw it up and maybe don't have the oxygen pumping into the water quite as intensively. Anyhow, this was very exciting work. It was very powerful. I saw this whole new vision for agriculture, for a way that agriculture could actually be part of the solution to climate change, part of the solution to hypoxia, is part of the solution to the many things that we're doing out there. You know, just a moment, one more depressing little perspective. What I learned back in the 70s was about pesticide use. You know that a child born right now in Ames this morning will have DDT in her tissue. Not because we've been using DDT anywhere around in Ames or even in the U.S., but it's a persistent toxin that is in all of our tissue because we were using it, banned it in the 70s, and also because we're using it around the world. Or Walter mentioned University of Washington. There's a study up there that I discovered in this course of my own evolution that showed that if they took 3 to 6 year olds, 75 of them, and put them on 100% organic diets for 90 days, and then switched them over for 90 days to conventional diets, nothing fancy, just regular food, 3 to 6 year olds, and discovered in the second 90 days that these kids had 6 times the pesticides in their urine, that they had pesticide residues when they were eating organic food. And by the way, they also found when they had another group, they started on regular food and switched to organic, they found that there was no titratable, there was no residue of pesticides within 2 weeks of these kids switching over to organic diets. Now, people say to Walter and me, hey, guys, it's all well and good, organics, but really it isn't proven yet. And what I would ask you and challenge you to think about is, actually, I think it's the chemicals that aren't proven. We've been on an 80, 90-year experiment with our bodies. All food was organic until the mid-1930s. All food. Every famous person you know in history. George Washington, Jesus Christ, Joan of Arc, everybody. They all ate organic food. And you can say, well, maybe they didn't live so long and, all that. Then I always point to Mozart, who, maybe he didn't live so long, but look how much he did in his short life. But I get off the point. The point is that we've been on this 80, 90-year experiment. We don't know. We don't know that that's the reason, because we've been eating, food with chemicals, that's why we have rising rates of cancers and other ailments. But we certainly can't rule it out. And so I looked at this stuff. We're using 10 times more pesticides. This is a study from Cornell. 10 times more pesticides used between from 1945 to 1989. But in the same period, we doubled our crop losses due to pest damage from 7 to 13%. I was at the business school earlier. Economists have a word for that. It's bankruptcy. You put more in, you get less out. That's not a good way to go. So here I was at my institute studying this incredible system, highly productive. By the way, we were getting better yields every single year. Why? Because the soil fertility was going up. We were getting macro and micronutrients way beyond what we were prescribing and applying with our synthesized doses of chemical fertility. And I had 25,000 people visiting me every year studying this place. It was very exciting. But then I had my big come down, the moment that led me to start this yogurt company. I went to visit my mother, who was the senior buyer at the Epcot Center in Florida. Have any of you been to Epcot? Can I see just... Okay, yeah, a bunch of you. They have something called the Land Pavilion there. And at that time, when I went in 1980, Kraft Foods was funding it. And Kraft was showing how food would be grown in the future, according to them. And you can imagine it was a little different from my view. It was a heated building with natural gas. It was a cooled building with natural gas. There was lots of pesticides, lots of herbicides, lots of chemical fertilizers to keep the system in balance. It was basically modeling conventional agriculture. And as horrifying as it was for me that that's what they were teaching about how food would be grown in the future, because I knew we couldn't keep this going. I knew that we couldn't keep sending externalities, all this waste, hypoxias, loss of topsoil. I knew the earth would sooner or later give out in terms of its fertility, as many, many civilizations, actually, in fact, as every past civilization has learned. When you destroy your soils, it's over. Egypt, Rome, Mesopotamia, all of these civilizations once had soils like you have in Iowa. But through abuse and not thinking linearly and not replenishing, they destroy those topsoils. And there are arguments that can be made that that's what weakened those civilizations. And I knew from my studies we couldn't do that. But the most horrifying thing I learned at Epcot was that for the 25,000 people who were visiting me every year, that's how many people were going through there and paying to go through there every day. And I came through this exhibit at the end, and I said to my mom, I said, Mom, this child of the 60s who hates business, I've got to become Kraft Foods. I've got to develop the power that Kraft has to reach this many people. And we launched Stonyfield shortly thereafter because I needed to have a business solution to try to put this into commerce. And I just have to tell you, 14 years later to the day, Stonyfield passed Kraft in sales of yogurt. We're actually now 6 times their size in yogurt sales. And now Kraft is out there with organic sliced American cheese singles and so forth. Now, why is that? Why has Kraft come full circle? And why has Kraft joined Walter and me? It's because this is what consumers want. How many of you want the yogurt with extra pesticides? Raise your hand. You know, how many of you want the glass of milk with double the dose of synthetic growth hormone? You know, there we go. We've got one. You know, the thing is that it's not what the average consumer wants. What we want is pure, delicious food that's nutritious and good for us. We also would like the earth to be replenished, not stripped. We'd like there to be some hope for future generations. We'd like family farmers not to be an endangered species like they are in my part of the world. And so I moved into the organic food business because I saw it as something that could provide answers to all of these different areas. Now quickly, what have I learned? 25 years. Well, I've learned a couple of things. One of them is I've learned it works. Our organic farmers, I'll mention quickly, we have 35,000 acres of organic sugar production in Brazil. The farms there, by converting to organic, by putting their carbon back into the soil, instead of burning each year at year's end, burning the stubble, they have increased their organic content of their soils to almost equal to what native forests were. They've improved the moisture holding capacity of their soil, so they need less irrigation. They've improved biodiversity. They have something like 350 species of birds and mammals and wildlife that have returned to these fields. They've had dramatic reductions in pest damage, and they've had 10% increases in yields since they launched, to the point where organic sugar, which used to cost 100% more than conventional, now costs exactly the same. Now, the reason for that is, first of all, they're getting higher yields. They have lower inputs. But the second is that conventional has gone through the roof because conventional is completely dependent on fossil fuel subsidies. And Walter mentioned $100 a barrel oil. Oil was $32 a barrel 7 years ago when George W. Bush took office. No one thought it would get to 100. But guess what? If it was 32 then and it's 100 now, where's it going by the time you get out of this place? You know, 125, 150, 200? Who knows? But we know it's going up. And what that means, as you all think about this and assimilate this, not just for extra credit, but for thinking about your lives, what this means is that everything is different from what you've been taught. Every assumption that every ag extension agent, that every farmer, that every economist, that every business person, that every human has made in a world where oil was under $60, $70, or $50 a barrel is entirely different at 125 to 150. Everything. Distances are different. Inputs are different. The cost of pumping water from deeper and deeper is different. The cost of chemical fertilizer is different. And when you add this to climate change, you realize that in fact, this is actually the only way out. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tells us we've got 10 years to adjust the trajectory of CO2 emissions for your generation to have any real hope. We're talking about 1 billion people who may be homeless in 2030, 2040, if we don't start to reverse climate change. And yet what we also know is that in U.S. agriculture, which emits 1.5 trillion pounds of CO2, if we could just eliminate chemical fertilizers alone, this is a University of Pennsylvania study, a Penn State study, if we could eliminate just chemical fertilizers alone, which is of course very fossil fuel dependent, we would get a net increase by putting carbon into the soil of 734 billion pounds of carbon into our soil instead of 1.5 trillion pounds going up. So agriculture's impact on climate change is dramatic and huge. But what I've learned in my 25 years is it works. It works economically. The farmers who we're supplying are all more profitable, who supply us, whether it's sugar, cocoa, fruits, milk, you name it. Their yields are up, their inputs are down. That's one thing I've learned. Second thing I've learned is that I've discovered a new way to do business. And I really encourage you to consider this point. The old way of doing business with food was make it as cheap as you possibly could, sell it for as much as you possibly can, use the margin there to buy a ton of advertising, to convince you and me and everybody else to try it, to engage in trial, and then hopefully a purchase test, and then eventually a repurchase, and then eventually you hope to get loyalty. Okay? And the only problem is, and I call it the Coke and Pepsi model, because what happens with that is you make it so cheap that eventually it's not food. I mean, there's ice creams out there that say natural on the label, but if you melt them, they don't change shape. Okay? You tell me if that's natural or not. Okay? And you know, soda, Coke and Pepsi, is that food? You know, there's nothing cheaper than sugar, corn syrup solids, and water and CO2. Is that food? Is that nutritive value? Our obesity trends would suggest not at all. But what happens is the other reason it doesn't work, forgetting nutrition, is that when you cheapen the food that much and you have this big margin and you depend completely on advertising to convince people to buy it, what happens is Coke sells when they're advertising, but when they back off, Pepsi surges ahead when they're advertising. And the net result is who bought a Super Bowl ad determines how they're going to do in the last 2 weeks of January. Who bid the most for these incredibly expensive ads. And marketers will tell you that advertising as a purchase influence has plummeted. Now consider the alternative. Invest and make food. This is what I've learned in hindsight. I didn't know this going into it. Put the money into farms. Put the money into better nutrition. Put the money into something that is delicious. Use more live and active cultures. Make it an improved product. Add fiber to your yogurts. Have fresher fruits. Have something that's delicious. And what you end up getting is loyalty. Without going through all that margin stuff, all that purchase, all that advertising. I will tell you, my gross margins are 10 points behind what my competitors spend. Okay, in other words, I'm 1,000 basis points more expensive than Dannon or Yoplait yogurts, but I'm actually more profitable than them down at the bottom line. Why is that? Because my consumer tastes my yogurt and falls in love with it. It's better tasting. It's real food. There's no gelatins. There's no dyes. There's none of that stuff. I was at a supermarket shelf. I was telling this story earlier in Florida last year, holding up a Yoplait cup. I was reading an ingredient, and a little old lady came up and tugged me on the elbow and said, "Son, someone your age really should be eating the Stonyfield," which was like a wonderful moment for me. And I asked her why. And she started reciting all the incredible things about our yogurt. They use 6 live and active cultures. They were the first company in America to make themselves zero emissions in terms of climate change. They pay family farmers a fair price. They invest in, they give 10% of their money to environmental causes. They give farmers grants to work on rotational grazing and composting their manure and methane digesters. And, I said, "How do you know this stuff?" She said, "Well, it's easy. My husband died last year, and we've got grandkids, and I want the grandkids to know their grandparents, and I want to stick around for them. And so I read labels, and I'm into organic food. This is the way the market's going. So what have I learned? I've learned there's a different model here. You don't have to make food cheap to be profitable. As a matter of fact, here's the punchline. My company for over 18 years has grown over 24% every single year in a category that's grown between 4 and 6%. 24% annual compounded growth rate over 18 years. And my bottom line is better, and I spend 1/12 what they spend on advertising. That's money to the farmers, money to my employees, money to me. And more importantly, that's survival. We've made it through a world where the giants could sort of squash me. I assure you my entire corporate budget is a rounding error next to what they spend on advertising. These are big companies. And yet I'm outgrowing them. And we're all outgrowing them. Organic cat food, organic wine, organic beer, organic pork, organic cheese. We're all outgrowing our categories. Why is that? Because consumers are discovering it's fresher, better tasting, and it feels good. It's an emotional connection. So I've discovered that. And finally, I've discovered one last thing. I've discovered that, you don't need to have advertising when you have a superb product, but you have to be a little bit more clever. And sometimes you got to talk about like real issues and treat the consumer intelligently. Not just hire some, celebrity who, charges you $1 million to appear in an ad and, look beautiful and glamorous. But we use our packaging. We talk about causes that we care about. I learned this lesson in 1984. We had no money. We went to a supermarket chain. We had 7 cows. This supermarket chain said to me, why are you selling? We're selling to a little store that had 7 stores. This 35-store supermarket chain called me up and said, Gary, why are you selling to my competitor, not to me? And we said, well, we don't have enough cows. He said, well, get some more damn cows, and slammed the phone down. And we took that as good business advice. We went out and bought more cows. Then he said, okay, great, your yogurt's here. How are you going to advertise? I thought, God, I can't afford to advertise. I have no money. I have to pay the farmers, what we think is a fair wage. But what I did have was cows, so I put cows up for adoption. I invited consumers to send in 5 lids. And when they sent in 5 lids, they got named the co-owner of one of our cows. They got a certificate naming them the co-owner. They got a photograph of their cow. And twice a year, their cow would send them letters. And the letters would talk about synthetic growth hormone and all these things I was interested in. Now they're much more ecologic cows. They send 4 emails a year, no more paper. And we've had several 100,000 people adopt cows. We have our moose letter, all the moose that's fit to print. It's electronic. We have 750,000 people who subscribe to one of our newsletters on nutrition, on health, on the environment, on climate, on cooking, and they get coupons they can download every month. The book, by the way, that is out here, which I hope you'll take a look at, is called How to Make Money and Save the World. And what it's about is all these stories, ways that we as entrepreneurs, because believe me, when you get out of here and you go up against Kraft or Kellogg's or whoever with your pork or your beef or your chicken or your dairy or whatever, you're not going to be able to outspend them. You've got to out-clever them. And this gives you hundreds of ideas for how my company, Walter's company, and many others have done that. So let me just say simply in closing to you, because obviously there's a lot more to be said about all these different topics, that the thing to understand here is that organics is at the we're a 20-year-old industry. I often describe organics in the early days when Walter and I started. I say that we had, wonderful, wonderful businesses back then. The only problem was you had no supply and no demand. In other words, it wasn't a business at all. But it was a passion. It was from the heart. But we've now built an $18.5 billion industry. As Walter said, it's 3.5% of total U.S. food. That's the good news. The bad news is we're only 3.5% of U.S. foods. We're at the very beginning of something. But I assure you, when you take the measure of trends that are going to impact your lives and the economies in your lives, climate, topsoil loss, toxification, obesity, diabetes, cancers, healthcare costs out of control, when you take those measures, you'll realize that we've got to do things differently. And organics, in terms of the total view of what organics really means, keeping farmers viable, retaining soil, our topsoil, our equity, getting toxins out, it's truly the answer to most of these questions, plus national security, less dependence on oil, and so on and so forth. But the reality is we have no political power yet. The reality, since this is partly about policy, and I'll just say this in closing, is that we are way behind the 8 ball in research. We get 1.5% of U.S. research dollars, even though we're 3.5% of U.S. foods. We have 5 or 6 people at the National Organic Program responsible for regulation of an $18.5 billion industry. You know, you've got one of the few champions in Tom Harkin in this country who understands this stuff and who's a dear friend of ours. But we can't wait for the politicians to come around to this. We have to vote with our dollar. We have to understand that